talk about what the soul is. What is the definition of the soul? The soul can be loosely defined as the infinite and eternal part of us. But the truth is, there really is no definition for the soul. The soul is undefinable. It's infinite and eternal. And part of the unconscious problem is that the soul cannot be defined by man. Man does not define the soul, but the soul defines man. So what we have throughout history, as in the traditional version of Christianity, is that a group of men came together and decided, this is what God looks like. This man named Jesus, in the figure of a human person, is what we decided that God would look like if he were alive. Unconsciously speaking, this is the result of man's tendency to want to define God for himself. Man wants to make a God unto himself, which he has done in the image, in the form of this man named Jesus. So it's almost in reverse. The truth is that God defines man. Man does not define God. So a group of people coming together saying, this is what God is. This man, this figure, this sinless person is what we think God is. That's pretty much an error. What needs to happen is we need to see that God is infinite and eternal. And those qualities are what define God, not being a human figure, being perfect, living up to a standard. Now, if we define God by being a human person who was sinless and who was perfect, we're still putting him in a box. There's these boundaries, these standards, these rules, these definitions of what we think God is. Again, God is infinite and eternal. You cannot put a boundary. You cannot put it in a box. You cannot restrict it. It's infinite. The very definition of infinite is being limitless. So if we decide this is what God looks like, then we're putting a limit on God, not knowing the true power of God. We don't really know God, is what's going on. God is infinite and eternal. He's not a man. Now, also we need to look at how throughout history, the Romans and even the Egyptians had a habit of making their leaders into gods. The pharaohs were considered gods. The emperors were considered gods. This is a tendency of mankind, which has been embedded throughout the fabric of civilization and handed down throughout the generations. Unconsciously speaking, most people aren't aware that this is a problem. And really, the enemy likes it that way. The enemy doesn't want us to know, because then it can go about his business without any opposition. It just continues to trick us and fool us into believing that we're separate from God, that God is not infinite. And as we're young, we're taught that God is everywhere. And then when we start to get into our teenage years, into our adult years, we somehow decide that God is everywhere except inside us. And that's a big problem, because God is infinite, God is everywhere, which must mean he's always inside us. It also means that since God is eternal, there was no time when God was never inside us. So what's happening on an unconscious level in traditional Christianity is that we believe we're separate from God. We need something to save us because we're sinful, we're bad, we're worthless. And that's the total opposite. The truth is that we are one with God because of the soul. The soul is infinite and eternal. There's no other way to experience God right here, right now, as we're alive, other than the soul. The unconscious belief is that, okay, God is outside of us. The Holy Spirit, God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit are somewhere outside of us, and they need to be gained. We need to acquire God. We need to acquire the Spirit. We need to acquire Jesus. We need to hang on to something. And that's the total opposite. That hanging on is what's actually causing us feelings of separation, because we're identifying with a part of us that's hanging on. We think this is all we are. There's a very limited, restricted part of us that we're experiencing, which is this personality. We judge it as sinful. Okay, maybe it is sinful. There's nothing wrong with that. But if we take that to be all of who and what we are, then it becomes a problem. We don't know the rest of our being is infinite, and we don't know that the value of the rest of our being is of eternal worth. Self-worth becomes a problem, and things spiral out of control. Very subconsciously, it happens one little baby step at a time. As we live our lives, we might go along feeling something in the background is haunting us, something is wrong. There's an emptiness that's haunting us in the background. But we don't really much pay attention to it because we always think there's something more important. So as we go through our lives, what happens is this background, this inner emptiness in the background starts to accumulate, and it starts to get more intense. It gets to the point, for me, it got to the point where it got so intense where it forced me to really buckle down and take a hard look at my own beliefs and the way the system is set up. I took a hard look, and it forced me to realize that there was something wrong. And in a way, that's a good thing, because without that pain, without knowing that there's this inner emptiness inside, I wouldn't know that there was a problem. And again, the enemy likes to keep it that way because it's the antithesis of the soul. It will do everything it can to avoid awareness of the soul.